In a small County Durham village, one name is carved into stone among the war dead. Malcolm Charles Frederick Matthews. Charlie, a son of Hutton Henry, a bricklayer, a young man who joined the army in 1940 and never came home. But Malcolm's story does not end on a battlefield. It does not even end in France. Because weeks after Dunkirk, after the smoke, the retreat and the drowning, the sea carried him across to the Dutch coast. And there, under German occupation, one British soldier was given a military burial by the enemy. This is the story of Charlie Matthews and the long journey home that ended in death. Malcolm Charles Frederick Matthews was born on the 1st of May 1914 at Hutton Henry in County Durham. He grew up in a village with old roots, a place shaped by fields, work, family and faith. A village centred around its green, with St. Francis's Church standing prominently at its edge. By 1921, Malcolm was living with his family at Wise's Buildings in Hutton Henry. By 1939, he was still there, now a 25-year-old bricklayer, living with his father, Malcolm George Matthews, and his mother, Laura. He was not a famous man, not a politician, not an officer, not someone who expected history to remember his name, just one man from one village. And like so many ordinary lives, his was about to be overtaken by war. Charlie enlisted on the 19th of February 1940. He joined the Royal Army Service Corps as a driver. His service papers describe him as 5'8", slim, with brown hair and blue eyes. They also raise an interesting question. Before the war, Malcolm had been a bricklayer, a skilled trade that could be protected in wartime. But on his military papers, he appears instead as a motor driver, a commercial chauffeur. Whether that was completely true, or whether Malcolm quietly reshaped his working life just enough to make sure he could serve, we cannot say for certain. But the result is clear. He was accepted, he was trained, and within weeks he was on his way into one of the darkest moments of the war. On the 10th of May 1940, Germany launched its Great Western Offensive. The Low Countries and France were struck with terrifying speed. In just weeks, the Allied front collapsed, and the British Expeditionary Force was driven back toward the sea. Charlie had only embarked for overseas service on the 13th of May. He had been abroad barely days when the world around him began to fall apart. He was not part of the long war. He was thrown straight into its crisis point. For Charlie Matthews, the road from Hutton Henry to the front was brutally short. With the German advance cutting through France and reaching the coast, the British Expeditionary Force and other Allied troops were left with one way out: Dunkirk, a port town on the northern French coast that suddenly became the centre of a desperate evacuation. The operation was given a name: Dynamo. Its purpose was simple in theory, but terrifying in reality: to get as many men off the beaches and harbour of Dunkirk as possible and bring them back across the Channel to Britain. Warships, transport vessels and smaller civilian boats were all drawn into the effort. Day and night, under air attack, under shell fire and under the constant threat that the route might collapse completely, men waited to be taken off the shore. Some were rescued from the harbour, some waded out to larger ships. Some were lifted by the smaller boats that would become part of the legend of Dunkirk. More than 300,000 Allied troops were eventually brought home. But for the men standing on those beaches at the time, there was no miracle yet. Only smoke, only noise, only waiting, and the fear that they might not get off at all. And somewhere in that chaos was Charlie. Dunkirk has often been remembered as a miracle, and in one sense, it was. Hundreds of thousands of men were brought back across the Channel. But for those trapped there, It was also exhaustion, confusion, fear, and chance. A place where units were broken, orders were lost, men were separated, and survival could depend on reaching one boat rather than another. For Charlie, Dunkirk was not a legend. It was the point where the record begins to disappear. He was later reported missing. Early reports placed him wrongly near Amsterdam. Only later was the record corrected, identifying him as having died with the British Expeditionary Force and buried at Harlingen in the Netherlands. That confusion tells its own story. These were chaotic weeks. Families waited in uncertainty, and the first reports were not always right. What now seems most likely is that Charlie did not die on land at all. He was almost certainly one of Dunkirk's sea casualties. The leading theory, careful and plausible though not fully provable, is that he was aboard the French auxiliary vessel Émile Deschamps, one of the last ships to leave Dunkirk during the final phase of the evacuation. We cannot say that with absolute certainty. There is no neat passenger list waiting to settle the matter. And in the chaos of Dunkirk, that is hardly surprising. But the timing, the burial context, the related casualties, and the wider pattern all point in the same direction. So while the ship itself remains a leading hypothesis rather than a proven fact, the broader truth is much firmer. Charlie Matthews was very probably lost at sea in the Dunkirk evacuation. If that reconstruction is right, then Charlie survived Dunkirk long enough to board a ship. Not safe, not home, but off the shore. And that matters. Because somewhere in that final crossing, after the beach, after the waiting, after the terror, there may have been a moment, however brief, when the worst seemed over. England was close. Home was close. And then disaster struck. If Charlie was on that final sailing, then he died not on the beach, but within reach of home. And somehow that makes it even harder to bear. And then, after the noise and the panic and the sudden violence of that final crossing, came silence. No homecoming, no confirmed grave, no clear answer for those waiting back in Hutton Henry. Only the sea. For weeks it kept its dead. And then, in late July 1940, the Dutch coast began to receive them. Not one or two, but waves of them. Bodies from the Dunkirk disaster and the waters around it were carried onto the Frisian Islands and shoreline. Among the first 4 recovered in this story were 1 German airman, 2 French evacuees, and 1 British soldier. That British soldier was Malcolm Charles Frederick Matthews. Think about that. A British soldier from County Durham, French evacuees from Dunkirk, a dead German airman, drawn together by the same sea. What happened next is one of the most striking parts of Charlie's story. On the 27th of July 1940, under German occupation, those first recovered bodies were taken for burial at Harlingen. And there, something deeply human happened. The British soldier was not hidden away. He was not discarded anonymously. He was buried with military honor. Malcolm's coffin was draped in the Union Jack. A ceremony was held. And in that moment, far from home, amid a war that had torn Europe apart, the enemy still recognized the dignity of the dead. In life, these men had belonged to different nations, different armies, different causes. But in death, on a distant shore, they were given respect. For Charlie Matthews, a village lad from Hutton Henry, dead at just 26, that was the burial he received. Not at home, not among his family, but not forgotten either. As if Charlie's loss were not enough, there is another cruel turn in this story. His mother, Laura Matthews, died on the 2nd of June 1940. Died not knowing the fate of her only son, right in the middle of the Dunkirk crisis. So while Charlie was being swallowed by the chaos of war, his family at home were living through grief of their own. And for years, confusion remained. The family believed for a long time that Charlie died on a Dunkirk beach and had been buried in Amsterdam. Only later did the record settle more clearly on Harlingen. That matters, because history does not arrive neatly for families like this. It arrives in fragments, rumors, corrections, half-understood messages, and names carved into stone. For Britain, Dunkirk became a story of survival, a story of endurance, of rescue, of defiance. And Churchill gave that moment its words. "We shall fight on the beaches." But behind those words were the men who did not return, the men beneath the headline, the men whose names were not spoken in Parliament, but were carried home in silence by families and villages that never forgot them. Charlie Matthews was one of those men, one of the lives behind the legend. Malcolm Charles Frederick Matthews was born in Hutton, Henry, on the 1st of May 1914. He enlisted in February 1940. He went overseas in May, and within weeks, he was gone. We cannot recover every final detail. We cannot say with total certainty which deck he stood on or what his last moments were. But we can say this: he was there. He was caught in the fall of France. He was part of Dunkirk's human cost, and when the sea finally gave him back, he was treated as a soldier. In Hutton, Henry, his name still lives on, and that is why we remember him. Before I finish, I should explain who Charlie was to me. He was not my direct ancestor. I did not grow up hearing his name as part of my own family line. My connection to him comes through my son. Charlie was the brother of my partner's great-grandmother, which means that while he is not part of my own bloodline, he is still part of the family story that now touches mine too. And that, in many ways, is what this project is about. Not just tracing names on a chart, but trying to bring people back into view. People who lived ordinary lives, who were caught up in extraordinary events, and who deserve to be remembered as more than just a name on a memorial. For Charlie, that is enough. And for me, it is reason enough to tell his story. If you've enjoyed this video and you'd like to see more stories of ordinary people long forgotten by time from my family and beyond, please consider subscribing. And if not, a like on the video really does help. Thank you for watching. This story is based on surviving military records, burial research, local history, and family material. Some final details of Malcolm Matthews' death remain unproven, and where certainty is not possible, the most likely interpretation has been stated honestly.